What is up, guys? It's your buddy Blue Spooky here. I wanted to ask you guys a question before we start. Since pretty much all the videos are an hour and 30 minutes lately, do you want me to keep the Megamix name, or would you prefer I go back to doing so-and-so amount of stories, volume whatever? Let me know what you guys think, because I'm rather conflicted on it myself. Besides that though, if you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of those really helps the channel and the video to do well, and ensures I can keep making these for a long time to come. I do my best to make sure that every story in these videos has not been read by me before. However, because I've read so many stories, some may slip through the cracks sometimes. So please understand if that happens. It's hard to keep track of every single one when I've read like 10,000 of them over the 10 years I've been doing this. If you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do, please be sure to click the join button. It should be somewhere around the subscribe button. You can support the channel for an additional $2 at the lowest tier, and you get special emoticons next to your name when you comment, and that you can use when you comment as well. No content is locked behind the paywall, of course. It's just something additional you can do if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do. Just watching is a big help already. Anyway, without further ado, I will get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. When I was a teenager, I liked to go over to a friend's house and have some beers with him. My family really didn't care that I was drinking. That's just sort of the way things were back then. There wasn't really a lot of things to do out where we lived, so drinking beer and chewing tobacco were things all us teen boys did. Only problem is, I didn't exactly have a car. My friend Troy had a pickup truck, and he would pick me up and drive down to his house. He would normally drive me home too. Almost every guy I knew, when he was driving, would have a beer sitting between his legs. So on this night, we were drinking beers and shooting the shit. Somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning, Troy wanted to go driving out in the hills. He liked doing that late at night, and we decided to bring his younger brother Jess with us. We were 17 and Jess was 14. I think Troy had been letting Jess have some beer that night too. So we packed into the cab of the truck with Jess in the middle. I loved driving through the hills at night, but I also knew Troy could be a bit of a dick when he wanted to be, especially when he was drinking. There were tons of different roads out there, and many of them just led to other roads into the middle of nowhere. Troy was having such a good time that he ended up driving a long way from the area we were supposed to be in. We ended up coming to this random obscure road that seemed to end in a driveway. The driveway led to an extremely old-looking shack. It looked like the kind of place a hermit would live, because it was in the middle of nowhere, and it didn't even have electricity or anything like that. Troy, of course, was very interested, and wanted to check the house out. I wanted to also, but Jess was a little too scared. He was worried something bad would happen to us. I guess he wasn't as drunk as Troy and I were. We didn't pull up to the house right away. Instead, we walked up the driveway and approached the place quietly. It was dark and we couldn't see much light. We had a cheap flashlight in the truck though, and were looking around the area. The light didn't have a strong beam, and we couldn't see as well as we wish we might have. We began wondering if anyone was even living there. I mean, it was late, but there was nothing to indicate any signs of life at all. We explored around the house and even went to the backyard. Suddenly, we heard Jess screaming from the truck. We immediately stopped what we were doing and ran around to the front of the shack and to the driveway. The headlights were still shining, but that made it harder to see anything. All we could do was hear Jess yelling at something that neither of us knew what it was. When we finally got to the truck, we saw Jess struggling intensely with someone who seemed to have pulled him out of it. "Hey, get the hell away from my brother!" Troy yelled. We saw the struggle going on. The person looked up at us. Troy had been carrying the flashlight, so he shined it directly in the eyes of this guy. Rather than getting a good look at him though, he put his arms up to block his face. I got to the guy first and grabbed him to try and pull him off of Jess. Needless to say, I was extremely shocked when the man turned around and bit a big chunk out of me. I yelled because I hadn't expected that. Before I could do anything in response, he bit me again. Troy grabbed the guy, and we were able to pull him off of Jess. Troy got bit multiple times too. The guy was extremely strong, and he kept trying to get away from us. He kept on biting us over and over. All Troy and I could do was fight back. We beat the guy over and over, until we were finally able to trip him and push him down a small hill. That gave us time to get back in the truck as he rolled down. As we got in the truck and had turned it around though, I noticed him sprinting back up on all fours. I told Troy to get the hell out of there, and he definitely did so. The man even tried to chase after us in the car for a few moments, but of course he couldn't keep up with us on foot. Jess told us he'd open the door of the truck to come after us because he didn't like the feeling of being there alone. All of a sudden, the man had emerged from nowhere in the darkness and rushed him and bit him all over. That's when he started screaming. There was a deep bite in his neck that even drew blood. The guy had bitten him over and over as he was pulling him out of the car. We didn't exactly know what to do. We got the hell out of there. We didn't go to the hospital either. We didn't know that human bites could be dangerous. We treated them at home and never went driving down that road again. I've spent the better part of my adult life as a painter. It can be tedious work, but it's paid me decent over the last 10 plus years. Being a painter has allowed me to open my own business, and to this day it's been very successful. Over the years, I've painted all sorts of houses. New ones, old ones, and everything in between. I had painted some houses that looked like heinous crimes had taken place there even. But none of the houses have ever been more memorable than a single house I was contracted to paint that was truly in the middle of Nowhereville, USA. You see, about 40 minutes away from where I lived at the time was this beautiful estate on many acres of land. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I do know it was a really big house with 3 stories and very old. The man who bought the house was an investor of some kind from Florida and wanted to buy a house in this area for some reason. I didn't really care about any of that though. The guy was paying me well, and a job is a job. My crew for this job was myself, my brother, and his wife. Since the house was so big, it was easily going to take several days on end to paint the entire interior. The guy didn't live here, and the house was empty, so that made it a bit easier. He was putting in some new flooring in a couple of weeks, so I wasn't worried about covering the floors either. It just made the job that much more simple. We started on Monday, and we were hoping to be finished by the end of the week. Since nobody was at this house, I was even planning on staying there a few late nights to get in some extra work. Monday was a little bit slow, but we did put in some decent hours. Tuesday, we really picked up some steam and got a lot of work done. My brother and his wife left at around 5:30 p.m., but I decided to stay behind and finish up one of the rooms we'd been working on. Well, those few hours I'd planned on staying turned into about 5 more, which was a major mistake. My back started to hurt so badly. I was feeling incredibly stiff too. It was closing in on 11 p.m., and I still needed to drive home. I also had to shower, eat, and get ready to be back there around 9 in the morning. I started cleaning myself up a bit and getting organized for the next day before I left. While I was gathering up some brushes and tape, I thought I heard the sound of whispering coming from one of the other rooms in the house. This house was objectively freaky. I mean, it was a giant mansion in the middle of nowhere with no furniture. It looked like a recipe from a horror movie. I'm not gonna lie, I almost expected a ghost or something to jump out. After a quick and not very thorough investigation, though, I chalked up all that whispering to just my mind. Or perhaps the wind or the house settling in. The house was old after all, so having a draft causing a creepy wind sound did not seem impossible. The next day came and I was feeling quite sore from the night before. Still though, I needed to get a good jump on the day ahead. I told my brother and his wife about the creepy whispers though. They were actually pretty freaked out. She's all about ghosts and creepy things, so she was having a real field day with this story. That evening, they decided to stay late with me and knock out a bunch more painting. I think really though, they wanted to potentially hear this spooky ghost. Either way, I was quite happy for the help. A little bit after 9, I heard a loud scream come from upstairs. It was my brother's wife, and it sounded like one of those life or death type screams. I remember having the thought running upstairs that maybe she was playing some sort of joke on us, but the scream sounded too real, and I didn't want to risk it. When we finally made our way to the room at the end of the hall, she was laying on the fetal position on the ground by the window she had been painting. She had a stand-up light that had been knocked over next to her, and some of the paint had been spilled across the ground too. At first, she was inconsolable. My brother was trying to ask her what happened, but she couldn't get any words out. I was more freaked out than I'd ever been in my entire life. I didn't have a clue what was happening, and I actually started to wonder if she'd actually seen a ghost, as implausible as that may seem. She finally started to speak though, and with fear in her trembling voice, she said, "I was painting around the windowsill. I saw the closet door behind me start to open. When I turned around, 2 people ran out of the closet down the hall somewhere." That was scarier to me than any ghost story. The idea of ghosts is quite silly when you think about it. You can just brush that off. But 2 people hiding in the closet? Well, that freaked me out much more than a hypothetical apparition. We grabbed our phones and went to the car, where we barely had any service. We did have just enough to call the police though, and the homeowner. Even though the house was out in the middle of nowhere, the police showed up relatively quickly, at least for the location. They searched the home, and we were horrified when they escorted not 2, but 3 people out of the house. 2 women and a man. The look in their eyes as they were being apprehended is still burned into my memory. They had these sort of dead but furious eyes, staring daggers at me in particular. Apparently, these people had been squatting there for months even before the house had been purchased. They'd somehow avoided being seen or found during that entire time. It makes my skin crawl, thinking I was alone in that house with them, and I had no idea they were even there. I don't know if they intended on hurting us, but all 3 of them had weapons on them. I'm happy I didn't have to find out. I'm not sure exactly what happened to them after they were arrested. All I know is that this job made me feel off from the very beginning, and apparently my gut feeling was correct. I'll never forget the sound of my brother's wife screaming out of my head. That's the kind of sound I hope to never hear again. Things got really bad after my dad died. My mom fell into a deep depression for years. She ended up marrying this awful guy who just used her all the time and hated us kids. It really sucked because she would have never given a guy like him the time of day beforehand. Things got really rough for me and my brothers and sisters. As the oldest, I did my best to try and protect the others, but it didn't really work. When I was 15, my stepdad hit my younger brother, and he and I got into an all-out fist fight. My mom immediately took his side when she came home from work and kicked me out of the house. I literally had nowhere to go. We had moved a lot of times after my dad passed away, and I really didn't have any good friends because of this. We didn't have any family nearby either. We lived a bit out in the country, so it wasn't like there were shelters or anything nearby. I spent a couple of days wandering around in the hills. Actually, it was the only thing I could think to do. There were multiple abandoned buildings I'd found that I could sleep in for a little while. There were also plenty of creeks with fresh water to drink. This was in the late spring too, so there were some apple trees I could steal apples from. You might be surprised about how I didn't run into any people for a long time. Well, it was surprising to me too. There were tons of hills though, and they went on and on and on. Even with nobody around to worry about though, it was still hell. I had to sleep with a tiny blanket I had packed and used my jacket for a pillow. I slept on the splintered floors of these abandoned little sheds, or whatever they happened to be. The whole time I was worried someone would stumble down from the mountains and catch me or something. One evening, I was sitting back in a small building, reading a book by flashlight. That was when I heard a strange sound, like a man groaning or something. I got up and looked out the window on the door of the shed. It was extremely dark outside, but I did just about manage to make out a shadowy figure of someone standing about 50 yards away. I quickly turned off my light. I had put a padlock on the door. I had brought one with me for safety when I got kicked out. I had always planned to sleep in these abandoned houses if that ever happened, so I knew I would need some extra protection in the form of that padlock. I watched the man from inside the shed. He was walking around, but mostly in my direction. Now, this shed was quite old, and you could tell no one had used it in decades. This guy was coming right towards it though, and he also seemed to have something ready in his hand. It was long, but I couldn't quite tell what it was. It might have been a gun or a particularly large knife. Who knows what? When I realized the guy was making a beeline towards the shed now, I did the only thing I could think to do. I took my blanket and went over to the farthest corner of the shed. I hid under the blanket and piled some dirt and random debris on top of me. I hoped in the dark he would not be able to distinguish me from my surroundings. I was too afraid to look out of my blanket to even see if he was there though. It felt like a long time passed. I was just about to peek out from underneath when suddenly I heard some more sounds, as if someone was trying to bust open the door. They began pulling extremely hard, and I heard the lock jiggling back and forth. I began to get very scared. It was even worse though when the man began slamming something against the door. I almost spat my pants as the pounding got fiercer and fiercer. He didn't begin yelling or anything, but rather started speaking in a strange gibberish I could not understand. I was scared and shivering. Whatever he was saying, he was clearly in some sort of tranquil fury. After a while, he stopped pounding. I thought he'd finally decided to give up, but he began to kick on the door and started yelling this time. I heard a gunshot and an awful guttural sound. I found out later that was a bullet going through the wood of the door. He shot the door several more times. I was crying silently in the shed, hoping he couldn't hear me. Not long after this flurry of shots, the man stopped pounding on the door. I was impressed with how strong that old rotting door was. That came later though. After he stopped pounding on the door, he must have walked away because it got real quiet. I waited there for what seemed like hours. It might have actually been hours now that I think about it. I thought maybe the guy was the owner of the land and the shed or something. Why else would this guy be out in the middle of the night in the mountains? Maybe he was some crazy hermit or wanderer or something. Whatever it was scary as hell. When I finally had the nerve to crawl out, I peeked through the window and saw that no one was there. Although I was terrified, I stayed in that shed for the rest of the night. The following day, I went home. Turns out my mom had been looking for me because her new husband had hit one of my other siblings while I was out. I guess she didn't realize that he was lying and kicked him out after. I can't lie to you, it was extremely hard to forgive her, but I eventually did so, and I was just happy to be home at the end of the day. I have an in-ground swimming pool in my backyard. It was one of the necessities I required when looking for my own house. I swam in high school and in college, so it was a really big part of my life that I enjoyed doing. I had to have a pool when I eventually bought a house because of this. I'd had a tough work week, so I just wanted to do everything I could to relax over the weekend. I was looking forward to the time just swimming in my pool. It was already getting dark outside by the time I arrived home on Friday. Still though, I swam many times in the pool at night, and I knew I needed a real good swim to relax. When I turned on the light by the pool and went outside, I noticed that the backyard light in my next-door neighbor's house was on too. I didn't think about it very much though. We had a fence between the yards that was pretty high, and I definitely had all the privacy in the world in my backyard. I was swimming for a while when I suddenly heard something. It was like a little plopping sound, like something had just fallen into the pool. I mean, it's not unusual for something like that to happen in an outside pool, but I also like to keep the place as clean as possible. I immediately started checking, trying to find out what this was. I had to go underwater to check fully, and what I found was what looked like a piece of rock lying at the bottom of the pool. It was kind of like white gravel, like you'd see used on a road or in a driveway somewhere. I surfaced and took a closer look. It was definitely what I had thought it was. It was a little confusing though, because how could something like that have just landed in my pool suddenly? I didn't think too much of it in the moment though. I just set it to the side and went back to enjoying myself. Soon after though, there was another plop. This was followed quickly by another, and then suddenly something hit me right on the head. I could assume right away that all of this was gravel, like the one I'd found before. Even though I hadn't checked thoroughly yet, suddenly tons of pieces of rock came flying, and I saw where they were coming from. They were being tossed over the fence from my neighbor's backyard. Trying to get away from this assault of rocks, I wasn't sure what I could do exactly. I was absolutely confused as to why my neighbors, who I didn't know but never had problems with, would even be doing something like this to begin with. I took some deep breaths and dove underwater so I'd be hurt less if I was struck by a rock. I swam to the end of the pool that was closest to my house, but before I could surface, I felt someone grab onto my head and begin holding me underwater. I did my best not to panic. I was pretty good at holding my breath, so I tried to remain as calm as possible. I tried to pull the hands off my head though, but it was extremely hard to do with no leverage. From my perspective, I didn't really think I would be drowning anytime soon, but it did seem this was the intention of whoever was doing this to me. I kept fighting them for a little while, and then suddenly the hands stopped holding me down. I immediately surfaced and took a breath, while also looking around. All I could see though was a figure running out of my side yard. I wasn't able to make out anything about the figure though. I decided it made more sense to go into my house and call the police than it did to go running after the guy. So that's exactly what I did. When the police arrived, they discovered that no one was next door at my neighbor's house. In fact, we found out later that my neighbors had been gone all week. They had left town for a family vacation. However, their house had been lived in, most likely by whoever it was that attacked me that night. They had no idea who it could be though, or why the person would have just attacked me like that out of nowhere. There was a time when I left home as a teenager. I don't want to get into the specifics too much. It was a real nasty time, and my parents seemed real nasty to me too. Looking back, it was probably just as much my fault though as it was theirs. I was a bit of a jerk. Anyway, we got into this big, huge fight, and I told them I was going to leave. They said, "Well fine, see what it's like out there on your own." I decided to do just that. I thought everything would be fine. I went to live with a guy named Chaz. He had been a pretty cool guy in all the time I'd known him. He lived alone with his father, who was barely ever home anyway. Seemed like the ideal situation to me. They lived out in a rural area, in a beautiful home. We knew each other really well, so he let me crash on his bedroom floor without much fuss. That was fine with me. I really didn't know much about Chaz's father though. What was stranger was that Chaz wouldn't tell me much about him either. I even asked him one time what his dad did for a living, and he basically said he didn't even know. I found that especially odd, but he said they didn't really spend much time together. He told me he pretty much had to raise himself, as his dad was basically never there. He just gave him money whenever he asked for it. Anything else was pretty much all up to him. Eventually, his father did show up, and I ended up having a weird little interaction with him. He seemed to have known I had been there for a good 2 months before I had this freaky experience. Chaz and I were up late watching movies in the living room when his dad just suddenly came home. He just ripped open the door without even saying anything. I was a bit afraid of the way the man was stomping around. I thought he might have been angry that I was staying there with him, but he just left the room. When he came back around, he was carrying some sort of semi-automatic rifle with him. He told us in an angry voice to either go to Chaz's room or stay away from the windows and get down. I wanted to run and hide immediately, but Chaz didn't want to go to his room and locked it with several different locks. I watched him carefully, seeing him pacing in front of the house back and forth. After a while, I saw a light of what seemed to be several pickup trucks pulling up to the home. The light shone in through the living room window and nearly blinded me. I asked Chaz if we should get the hell out of there right now. He simply told me not to worry about it, and this had happened several times before. It was likely not going to turn into anything. I heard Chaz's dad screaming some things at the guys in the trucks. I heard them yelling back at him. I couldn't really understand what any of them were saying, though. I took Chaz's word that this wasn't that big a deal, but it wasn't easy to do that, especially when I heard a few gunshots ring out in the night. After a few seconds, multiple gunshots started ringing out. I jumped up in surprise, but Chaz shoved me back down. He said they were simply warning shots, and I shouldn't get so uppity about something like this. Happens all the time, he said. A couple of moments later, an absolute fire of gunshots rang out. Apparently, those were just shots in the air too. I mean, they must have been, because they didn't seem to actually hit anything, and no one was crying out in pain or seemed to be shot. Chaz was eerily calm throughout this entire thing. That was probably the most unnerving thing to me. His dad was out on the front yard having a gun standoff with several armed men in pickup trucks, and he just sat there eating popcorn and watching a movie. I don't really have words for how scary this was. There was a long while of more gunshots, and eventually the truck sped off in a hurry. Chaz's dad came back inside with his gun. He didn't say anything to either of us. He just walked down to the basement, and that was the last time I saw him all night. I asked Chaz to explain what the hell just happened, and he seemed pretty disinterested. All he would tell me was that his dad worked with some guys, and they often had clashes like this. He said it wasn't unusual or even uncommon. No one ever really got shot too badly or hurt, though. He told me to just ignore it the next time it happened. I had to stay with Chaz for a long time because of circumstances, so this incident actually did repeat itself several times. They never told me what exactly was going on with these armed standoffs, but as weird as it seems, as it went on, I really did start to become more like Chaz and just ignore the whole situation. It was pretty surreal. This is a story from a couple of years ago, when my buddy, 19, and I, 17, were out running and stumbled upon something very strange. I lived in quite a small town at the time, with a large industrial plant nearby, where most of the people there worked at. There were a few that didn't get their breadcrumbs from legit sources though, for example, the local gangs. Luckily, when they had their disputes, they usually just shot and harassed the other gangs in the area, and mostly spared the locals who lived there. I had not stumbled upon any unrest in this manner, and had never been in any crossfires before this day. My buddy and I were preparing to take a long run around town, taking some small roads and trails to get the miles clocked in. We started running some back roads, and were enjoying the run and the small talk about some games we were playing at the time. We took some right and left turns, and after a couple of miles, my friend said he knew a small path to the next neighborhood. It was a path over some train tracks, where there were usually no trains running. so it was safe to walk over. It was quite a fun path as well, with many ups and downs. There was nice forest scenery too, a very sparse pine forest with some large trees mixed in. We ran for 1 minute on this path. When we saw a bit further down, there was a duffel bag laying under a small bush on the right side of it. Obviously, this was new here, and it seemed to be full of something as well. In my head, I was thinking at first someone might have forgotten it there, but then I remembered that this path was not a path someone would just go down with a duffel bag. Usually, it would be people just running past like us. I turned over to my friend. "Hey, do you see that bag?" He answered, "Yes." I asked him, "Should we look and see what's inside?" "Nah, it's probably nothing in there." We continued down the path and didn't think that much of it. Here's where the strange part comes though. We had just passed the train tracks when a couple of yards further down, we saw a man standing in a black suit who seemed to be having a serious conversation on the phone. He seemed quite surprised to see us running from that direction as well. He had black gloves on, was quite muscular. His phone also looked like some sort of prepaid device. My heart started racing, and my adrenaline started pumping. What was a man with a suit like this doing here in the forest? I tried to act cool and nodded hello to him. He was still on his phone talking to someone and seemed not to mind us running beside him on the path. A while after we encountered this strange man in the black suit though, we both thought to each other, what was in that bag? He must have been looking for it. That's when I fully understood what could have happened to us if we had decided to check that bag and take it with us, or even just search the bag's contents at all, and the man stumbled upon that discovery. Going through a hard breakup can make you do some things you're not proud of. For a lot of people, that means going out and meeting someone to rebound with, which is never a good thing. For some people, you can even meet a rebound without even realizing it, and that's what happened to me. About a year ago, I had been with my ex for 6 years. When we finally broke up, it really hit me hard, and I was struggling for a while. We'd bought a house together even, but she kept the house in the end. I honestly didn't want to stay there. It just depressed me being there, and so, with my now limited funds, I found myself a cheap place to rent. I wanted to lay low and get back on my feet, afford a nicer spot eventually. I literally let her keep everything when we broke up, so I didn't really have anything to my name. I found a month-to-month place to rent on the marketplace, and that's when I realized there was a ton of stuff on there to actually buy too. I bought a couch, a recliner, a TV, anything you could really think of. I felt like the king of saving money. The one thing I didn't have though was some tables and chairs, which made it sort of hard to have people over, either to play games or even just eat food together. I found this girl who we'll call Leia, who was selling a table and a set of chairs. They looked very nice and in great shape, so I messaged her. Long story short, I went and took a look at the merchandise. They were just as advertised. While I was there loading up the chairs in my truck, I started talking with her. Turns out she'd also just gone through a horrible breakup, and she was unloading a bunch of stuff. Well, our small talk turned into 2 hours of laughing and joking in her driveway. We ended up exchanging numbers and set up a little date to go out and grab a drink that weekend. I was real excited about this, since I felt I had a sort of connection with her. The date went well too. We went back to her place after the bar that night, which led on to several more dates. Before I knew it, I was seeing this girl on a regular basis. About a month later though, I started to notice that some weird things were happening. I would go to the bathroom and my phone would be in a different place, or my computer screen, which had been idle, was now turned on. I figured she was trying to snoop on me or something, which, in all honesty, I had nothing to hide anyway. So I really didn't push the matter. I just sorta shrugged it off. I figured she would realize I wasn't hiding anything, and she would eventually stop going through my stuff. One night, we started hanging out after we both got home from work, and I could tell she was really upset. I asked her what was going on, and she told me she had seen I had been texting my ex. She was worried I was going to go back to her. For context here, I had texted my ex recently asking if she'd received my doctor's bill in the mail, since I hadn't received it at my current address yet. She responded by saying she'd let me know if it ever showed up, and that was the end of the conversation. I wasn't mad yet. I understand some people have severe trust issues, and how that can be really tough. I explained it well to her what happened, and told her that I wasn't mad, but she should always talk to me about this stuff. The rest of the night was pretty fine. Next Saturday, she stayed over at my place. We fell asleep at about midnight, but I woke up a little bit after 3 in the morning because of a strange feeling. When I looked up, she was standing on my bed over me, literally standing on the bed, holding one of my golf clubs above her head with both hands. I instantly put both my hands up to block and slid to an upright position. I asked her what was going on and if she was all right. She was practically sobbing, and I could barely understand her. When she was able to finally get the words out, she told me this: "I know you're hiding something. Where is it?" I truly had no idea what she was talking about. I slid on the bed backward while she was still sobbing. Thankfully, she caught me just a second too late. She swung the club down and missed me by just half an inch. I ran out into the living room and couldn't believe my eyes. She'd completely torn apart my home. I mean, she ripped up all the pillows, knocked over the bookshelves, even went through all the cabinets in the kitchen. My computer was open, and I could see hundreds of tabs open. I started to get a bit livid. She had ruined all my stuff. She came out of the bedroom, no longer holding the golf club. She was bawling, begging me to forgive her, claiming she hadn't meant to destroy everything. Then, like the flip of a switch though, the tears and sobbing turned into anger. "I'm just so hurt about Nicole." I'm sure I looked quite confused, since I had no idea who this Nicole could be, or who she was talking about. I tried to start defending myself, but she started shouting she knew all about Nicole. She'd seen everything. With no notice, she charged at me and pulled a knife out from her waistband. Thankfully, I'm much bigger than her, so I was able to hold her back until I could reach the door. Once I got to it, I ran out as fast as I could to the local corner store. It was open 24 hours a day. I burst through the front doors and told them to call the police right now. Thank God they did, and the police showed up pretty quickly. I explained to them everything, and this whole ordeal ended up being an even bigger nightmare. Turns out that Leia was unfortunately not very well in the head. I'm sure that's quite obvious now. I'm not exactly sure what she ended up being diagnosed with, but I was actually kind of sad for her. In the moments where she was actually sane, she was such a sweet girl. I hope she ended up getting the help she needed. I still think about that night quite a lot. The memory of her standing over me as I woke up with a golf club was something I'll never forget. Ever since I bought that table from her, I haven't used the Facebook Marketplace, and I honestly don't think I ever will again. I was bullied a lot when I was younger. When I got into middle school was when it was the worst. I came from a pretty poor family, so I didn't always have the best clothes. Many were hand-me-downs, and a lot of them were worn pretty severely. Most of the bullying came from kids who lived in town. However, the country kids joined in too. Many of them were even poor like I was. I simply had the detriment of being smaller than all the other guys, so I was an easy target. I was a really good student too, so that completed the perfect trifecta of bullying. Poor, small, and smart. Even though I was smart, I hated going to school. At least when I was home out in the country, I didn't have to deal with all the bullies. I had my siblings to play with, and we got along very well. Being home was a lot nicer than being at school, which was full of testosterone-filled idiots who lived to pick on others. Summers were the absolute best. Although I don't particularly care for hot weather, I got to be away from the constant torment. There were some kids who lived down in the holler down the road from me who were jerks to me as well. However, I rarely encountered them during the summer, even though I spent a lot of my time out in the woods. One thing I really liked to do was find this area where I could meet up with the train tracks. There was a long track that ran through the country for miles and miles. A beautiful scene, too. I like to imagine myself on the train, just passing through this beautiful country setting. Occasionally, when a train would come by, I would sit up against a tree and just watch it pass. I was out there one summer day, walking along the train track and minding my own business. After a while, I saw some people up in the distance. I couldn't make out who they were, and I didn't really pay attention to them until it was too late. It turned out to be 3 kids who really bullied me bad in school. Curtis, Tom, and Billy. Here I was in the middle of the hills with nowhere in sight to get away from them. When I knew who they were, I tried to just casually walk off. I was hoping they wouldn't know it was me. I failed though. They chased after me, and I didn't get very far until they caught me. I was pretty scared I was going to get beaten up, but they didn't do that at first. They just talked like jerks and insisted I sit down and talk with them. The whole situation was weird. They wanted me to sit with them and watch when a train came. I didn't really know why, but I was glad they weren't going to beat me up. We waited, and I almost thought the guys were going to be nice with me. Then we heard a train coming off in the distance though, and that's when everything happening changed drastically. The boys all grabbed me and began pulling me down to the tracks. I tried struggling against them, but it was no good. Even one of them would have been too strong for me to resist, much less all 3 of them. When they'd pulled me down to the tracks, they revealed what they were planning to do. They were going to wait until the train was right there, hold my head down to the track, and let the train kill me. I was terrified, and I believed them. I struggled and tried to get free, but I knew I couldn't. I kept watching the train get closer and closer. The kids were mocking me, telling me I was about to die as I was crying. When the train finally got close, they made as if to push me down right in front of it. However, when they pushed, they all kept a firm hold of me. The push was minor. They pulled me back just in time from the tracks and let me fall down. I lay on the ground crying. I think they probably thought they had done enough, because other than mocking me, they didn't even try to beat me up or anything. They just laughed at me and eventually left. The event was scary for other reasons, though. I had no idea they weren't actually going to hurt me. But also, they had no idea their plan was really going to work. If they had messed up, I would have easily been killed. I didn't tell anyone about the incident, and I guess they didn't either. They probably thought they would get into some real trouble. As for me, I was embarrassed and didn't want anyone to know. Before we begin, let me give you a little description about myself. I'm a 20-year-old college student who's been back home for the summer recently. I also happen to be extremely small, 4'11" to be exact, 105 pounds with a serious case of noodle arms, literally zero muscle. Now let's get to the story. Last night around 8:30 p.m., I was walking the dogs with my mom. We have 2 dogs, Daisy and Major. Daisy is the senior. At 13 years old, she has bad arthritis because her torso is too heavy for her stubby legs. Because of this, we make it a point to not take her on long walks anymore. Before we even made it to the main street, Daisy went to the bathroom right away. I told my mom she could go ahead and head back home, while I took Major with me for a longer walk. My mom was hesitant about this though, and at first she refused. I knew my mom had some work she had to get back to, so eventually I did convince her to go back. I told her it was just a short walk and I had our German Shepherd mix with me anyway to protect me. Finally, she agreed, but told me to be careful and make sure no one was following me. A little bit weird and specific, but I agreed nonetheless. Now, I should add that I didn't have my phone with me at the time. It was about to die before our walk, so I had left it to charge at home. Still, I was confident, because I'd walked dogs on this street numerous times before and never had an issue. From there, I turned left from the street we lived on and onto the main road. This made it so the traffic going in the opposite direction would be closest to me. Every building on the main street was some sort of doctor's office, and all of them were closed at this time. The parking lots were all empty as well. I walked for a bit on the left side, before deciding to cross over to the right side of the street where the dentist's office was, just past the vet area. Before I could do that though, there was a car approaching on my side of the street. I waited patiently for them to pass before walking across. As I was walking, I took note that the car that passed by was red. I stopped just before the dentist's parking lot. Usually I just walk behind the dentist's office, but this night I hesitated. After a full minute of major sniffing at nothing of interest, I decided against going back there and walked past the front instead. I opted to go back the long way home. Not even 30 seconds after I decided not to walk in that direction, a car pulled into one of the two entrances of the parking lot and parked in a parking spot as if waiting for me. I had never seen anybody pull into the lot of this street so late at night before, so I was immediately suspicious. I checked behind me, checking to make sure it was not the same car I'd seen just a minute ago. After 30 seconds went by, the car pulled out from the parking space, jerked back to the other entrance, the one closer to me, then pulled out just far enough for me to see it was in fact the same red car. I still couldn't conclude they were following me just yet, so I remained calm and kept staring as I continued to walk away. Just before the end of the block I'm on, I pulled Major and I off the sidewalk. That's when the car swerved from the lot and beelined towards where I was. I pulled us even further away, behind a tree that Major decided to mark, completely oblivious to the situation. The red car was about to pass us when it slowed down. I was using the tree as a shield to hide behind, glaring at the car through the branches. The car eventually moved past me, instead of coming to a complete stop where I was. I took the initiative to immediately change my trajectory and start going back the way I came. My hope of the car simply continuing down the street died immediately when he took a hard left and swerved into the parking lot right across from me. He accelerated across the lot as he turned the car to face with his headlights on me. By now, my adrenaline had kicked in. I became extremely upset. Not only was he following me, but he was also driving erratically. It was starting to scare the shit out of me. Keep in mind, there was also nobody else driving on the main street. I thought I was effectively alone until I saw a silhouette walking towards me on my side of the street. I couldn't be sure because it was so dark out, but I thought it could be my mom. She has a short stature like me, but it was hard to tell from this distance. If not her, it could be someone taking a walk. I continued walking towards them to see if it really was her. Just then, the car accelerated again and pulled into the lot adjacent to the one they were just in. I started quickening my pace, when finally the vet's light flickered on and illuminated my mom's face. "Mom?" I called out as I quickly turned my head to watch the red car repeat its pattern of turning into the next lot, then continuing towards me. "Yes, it's me." She too was eyeing the strange red vehicle as she waited for me to catch up with her. I was a little dismayed to see she didn't seem to be carrying her phone with her. Nonetheless, when I got within earshot, I vehemently stated there was a maniac on the loose. To my surprise, my mom said, "I know." The man was about to repeat his crazed cycle when I finally got to see what he looked like. He must have put his window down at some point because I could see his side profile as he drove his car erratically in the street once more. Except he wasn't looking at us. The curly, bald man was looking at his car dashboard as weird beeping noises emanated from his car. I had to actively fight the urge not to yell at the man to get lost. The driver became even more erratic. He pulled into the next lot, then drove over the curb into another lot on the next block. We took that opportunity to cross the street back towards our house, but that also brought us closer to him. He must not have expected us to cross though, because he drove far enough ahead to allow us to pass him from behind. He gave us a good view of his bumper too. His license plate read CMMJ65. We were now in the home stretch. I wasn't looking back as often at that point. I just wanted to get home. My mom, however, said she saw him turn around again to face our street. He may have kept watching us from there, but we had no way to know for sure. My mom explained to me that when she got Daisy back inside, she told my stepdad to feed her. She had to run back outside to get me. She said the whole time she'd walked back home, she couldn't shake this bad feeling about me. She just had to come back and make sure I was okay. Then she got to see for herself how this deranged driver was swerving in and out of lots, trying to follow me. Once we made it home, we reported this incident to the police. We gave his license plate number and described what happened. The dispatcher even commented how weird this was. I don't want to know what the guy was thinking. I'm just so happy my mom had the intuition to come find me. I don't know what I would have done to get myself home otherwise. The rest of that night I spent it awake and wondering what I could have done better in that situation. I was afraid that if I tried to run, it would have provoked him and he would have really tried to chase me. Then there wouldn't have been any way to outrun him. I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone behind the dentist's office before I decided not to. I don't like thinking about it. My mom thinks the noise is coming from his car or some sort of police radio, and that's another terrifying thought in itself. My name is Nikki, and I had a really weird experience back when I was in college. It still haunts me to this day. When I was a freshman in college, I didn't get to experience the college experience the way many do. I didn't go to any of the football games, even though I'm a huge football fan. I didn't date any guys, and I didn't even go to a single party. I was so thoroughly concerned with succeeding academically that I put 100% of my focus into my schoolwork. It really paid off, and I did get straight A's all year, but I really felt like I was missing out on what college was supposed to be. As a sophomore, I decided to take part more socially. Not having made many college friends, this wasn't very easy to get into. I attended a few football games by myself and tried to join some various clubs. I really had a problem connecting with a lot of the other members though. Where I was successful in making friends, however, was in class. Several classes, when we were put together for group work or whatever, I was able to really connect with my fellow students. By October, in my first sophomore semester, I was successful in making quite a few friends, and I got invited to a Halloween party. I was nervous going, and I guess I was right to be. Although I got to talk with a lot of my friends, it was only for short periods of time. It was a pretty wild party as it turned out, and they had plenty of other people to talk to as well. There was this one guy who was dressed up as what I guess was some sort of anime character. I wasn't really sure. He kept looking at me from across the room before eventually coming up to me. He said his name was Chris and asked me what I was drinking. I was having a rum and coke, and he started talking about how much he liked that. He offered to go and get me a new drink. I was so happy at having someone talking to me that I accepted right away. He left and a few minutes later came back with 2 rum and cokes. He handed me mine and he started drinking his. After a while, he seemed to be getting hit really hard from the alcohol. He began slurring his words strongly and eventually started swaying from being dizzy. I assumed he was either a real lightweight or he had been drinking a lot beforehand. When he slumped against the wall and seemed ready to pass out, I got really concerned. I didn't know what to do in this situation. I sought out one of my friends. I told them he had only had a single drink. They called an ambulance just in case. I'll never forget what happened in that moment. We laid him down on his side and went to check if he was alright by checking his vitals. They just so happened to run their hands over his pocket, where they found he had a bottle of Rohypnol hidden away. It was in his system as well when they did tests after. I had an idea about what happened after that. Rohypnol is a common date drug, you see. I think Chris had gone to get drinks, and both drinks were rum and cokes. He had roofied one of them, intending to give it to me, but he ended up forgetting which one it was. He ended up drinking the one with the drugs in it himself. I'll never forget how lucky I was that night. I used to get into a lot of fights with my stepmother. Things were pretty happy at home, ever since she married my dad. I asked my mom if I could come stay with her for a while, but it seemed she was too busy to house me. It really sucked, honestly. Things just got more and more difficult, and it eventually all came to a head when my stepmom accused me of stealing something from her. Of course, I hadn't done this, but my dad immediately believed her over me, and we got into a huge fight about it. I really couldn't take it anymore. After they went to sleep, I packed up a duffel bag and a tiny bit of money I had, and left for a couple of nights on my own. I was able to sleep at a friend's house at first, but I was only 16, so that really didn't last very long at all. After about 4 or 5 nights, I was faced with the harsh reality of sleeping on the streets. It scared me for sure, but not enough to make me go home after that big argument. My first night on the streets, though, was probably worse than you can ever imagine. It was just a complete nightmare. I didn't really sleep at all. I tried to sleep at the train station at first, but the doors were locked, so I slept outside instead. I felt myself drifting off a few times, but I really couldn't get any sleep. I did have a little bit of money on me, so the next day I took the train into the city. I figured there would be more places to sleep there. It turned out I was right. The following night I found myself holed up in an alleyway, and I curled up next to the garbage can. I actually did manage to sleep for a while before I felt a sharp tapping wake me up. I jumped and grabbed my bag. There was a girl there who also looked homeless. She was fairly nice actually though, and told me it was dangerous to sleep in such a place. She told me there was a nicer place nearby where people were squatting, and she asked me if I wanted to accompany her. Although I was scared at first, I realized it might be better to get some sleep with other people around. I went there with her. I followed her there. There were a lot of people squatting in this old home actually. It seemed kind of weird actually. People were grouped together in circles talking quietly. I really didn't know how much more comfortable I was going to be there than in the alleyway, but she took me into a room that only 2 other guys were in. It seemed she knew them all, and they all welcomed me with friendly smiles. They wanted to know if I wanted to hang out. I found out a few minutes later she would be doing heroin with them. I let them know I was only interested in sleeping. I was not into the whole idea of getting hooked on drugs. I was so tired though that them doing heroin in the same room didn't even bother me. I figured I wasn't going to do it, so it was no big deal. I went into the corner for a little bit. I actually watched what they were doing. I was tired, yeah, but I guess now I was also a bit scared of them and curious about how they were doing this. It was hard to watch, especially when the girl did it. I mean, she had been nice before, but now she was just acting all weird and crazy. I liked her because she had helped me, but I didn't want to be anywhere near her in this moment. Watching them all shoot that stuff up was really hard, but after a while, I actually managed to doze off a bit. Later though, I felt someone up against me, which woke me up almost immediately. I opened my eyes, and it was the girl from before. She smiled at me, and I did too. I was just about to close my eyes when she rubbed my pants a bit. We were both too out of it to do anything though, so she fell asleep right on top of me. Later on though, I felt someone tugging at my arm or doing something with it. It was really annoying. I thought it must have been the girl who had woken up since though. I tried to keep the sleep going, but I woke up immediately when I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm. Opening my eyes, I saw a much older man standing over me. I hadn't seen it before. Right in my face, though, he had pulled my shirt sleeve up and put some sort of band on my arm. It only took a few moments for me to realize this guy was going to shoot me up with heroin while I was sleeping. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed. I tried to pull my arm away from him. "I'm gonna kill you like you killed her," he said, motioning towards the girl. I looked over at her, only to see she was lying with her head against the wall, clearly breathing perfectly fine. I pointed out to the man that she was still alive, but the man grabbed hold of my arm even tighter. Most of what happened next was almost a blur. He had a needle at the ready, but I resisted as hard as I could. Eventually, I got a good kick on the guy, and he let go of me with his hand. I grabbed my bag and sprinted out of the house. I kept running until I found a place to hide until the following morning. The following day, I found a shelter for runaway teens and stayed there for as long as they would let me. It was a long time, and there was no happy ending to be found anytime soon. I never went back to my parents, and I didn't see them for years, actually. I lived in shelters, hopping back and forth, until I eventually got a job and then an apartment, and made something with my life in the end. When it comes to schoolwork, well, I've had some traumatic experiences in my life, and as a result, it kind of makes me feel off. I just can't seem to focus at all when I'm home, even when it's very quiet. Every little thing bothers me, and I feel like I read the same line a million times over and over. In my sophomore year of college, I started to drive to a secluded location to do all of my readings for school. I didn't live very far from the country, so it would only take about 20 minutes to drive to said peaceful location. I personally found the peace and tranquility of nature to be very soothing. I know it may sound crazy to some people that I would drive that far to the middle of nowhere just to do my schoolwork, but it really felt like I had no choice. It was the only way I could bring myself to concentrate on my work. When the end of my senior year was approaching, I was starting to freak out about one of my big exams. The exam itself was 40% of my final grade, and I needed at least a 75 on it to pass the course. I decided that I was going to spend the weekend before the exam studying, and that I was going to make my own little adventure out of the experience. Instead of going to my usual secluded spot, I was going to travel to an area a few hours inward. I would hike the beautiful trails and find another nice quiet spot to study. I left first thing Saturday morning and arrived at my destination around 10 or so. I spent the earlier parts of the day hiking until roughly 2 in the afternoon. I found this absolutely amazing spot near the top of this steep hill. It was a clearing that overlooked a bunch of trees. There were some rocks on the top of the hill too, so I was able to get comfortable with my books and computer set up on them. I started reading my textbook when I thought I could hear the sound of twigs snapping around me. Now, in my distracted brain, all I could concentrate on was that sound of twigs snapping. It was absolutely driving me crazy. I first thought there must be some sort of deer or small animal prancing around in the woods nearby. I debated on whether I should go over and maybe scare the animal away. Whatever it was would surely flee further away into the woods and away from me so I could focus. I made my way over to the edge of the tree line and shouted some nonsense noises to try and scare whatever this was away. I heard nothing back. I made a sound again and clapped my hands together. Again, I heard nothing. I stared intently through the thick trees when I swore I got a glimpse of a silhouette of a person moving behind one of them. I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept looking for a little while longer, but I realized the noise had stopped altogether. I thought to myself that whatever I'd done must have worked. I sat back down and started to read my textbook again, but now I couldn't concentrate because I couldn't ditch the feeling that something was not right about this. I flipped through several pages several times. Once I realized I was not retaining anything, I simply decided to pack my things up and start heading back. I was fairly far away from where I'd parked anyway, so I figured it was about time to start heading back. I would just find a spot to study that was a bit closer to where I'd parked, but still in seclusion. When I walked over to the tree line, though, I paused in fear. Standing about 30 feet away, shrouded by trees, was the backside of what appeared to be a man. Their shoulders were very broad, but because their back was facing me, I couldn't be sure who they were. They were dressed all in black, and it looked like they were wearing some sort of covering on their face. I didn't move or say anything. I just stood there frozen and tried to calm down. I had a million thoughts flying through my head. It felt like I was stuck there for an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a few seconds later. The person turned to abruptly face me. I can't accurately express how much fear I felt in that moment. Whatever mask they were wearing was horrifying. It appeared to be some sort of homemade creation, since I'd never seen a mask like this in my life. It appeared to be white, and also had a long snout hanging down. It almost looked like something out of Beetlejuice. The eyes on this mask were jet black, and wild hair protruded from random patches on it. I think the hair was attached to the mask too, not to the person. It was sort of an old, rotten yellow color. The person started to hum. I didn't notice it at first, but it appeared to be some sort of melody. It was a really long, drawn-out hum, almost like a groan coming from this person. They started to approach me. I freaked out. The clearing I was in was not that big, so in order to walk back to the trail, I would have to move past this person. I could have slid down the hill, but I might have broken my computer and also my legs. It was extremely steep and very high up. As soon as they'd started moving, this person started to run full speed at me, still making that horrible groaning noise. I can't even believe what happened next. The person ran right at me, and right when they were about to grab me, they just stopped in front of me. I stepped back in fear, and they began to laugh at me. Then they started humming again. They didn't actually lay a single finger on me. They just moved their hands around me as if they wished to touch me but couldn't. Not wanting to know what was happening or take any chances, I ran as fast as I could around them. As I sprinted further away, I could now hear the person trying to follow close behind me, still humming their tune. I didn't bother to turn around. I made it to my car and discovered that person no longer appeared to be following me. I did try to call the police, but of course phone service was pretty shoddy in this area. I drove several miles to the closest town and called the police once I got there. I reported what happened, but I don't think they did anything with it. Technically, the person didn't do anything other than disturb me. There were also no other complaints about the area. I have no idea what the freak was doing in those woods. I don't know if they were playing some type of prank or something truly messed up. Maybe they actually wanted to hurt me. It seems unlikely it was a prank though. I didn't see anybody else in the woods, and it seemed like we were the only two people in the area. I realized that maybe I shouldn't complain, since I was unharmed in the incident, but the psychological trauma that I felt still sticks with me to this day. I'll never forget that terrible afternoon and the memories of that horrifying mask. I don't know why there seem to be so many scary stories that take place out in the country. I don't know if it's because there's less people around in general, or because it's more quiet and there's less light. I mean, even I have a story that's terrifying that took place out in the country. When I grew up, my parents had this really large piece of land. It was all hills and trees and beautiful countryside. Both of my parents were hunters too. I always think it's funny to tell people about that. My dad died before she did. But even when that woman was in her 40s, 50s, or 60s, she would still take her gun out and go hunting. Growing up in a family like that, it was pretty much expected I learn how to hunt too. My dad would take me out at a very young age to teach me. At first, I didn't really like it, you know. Little kids don't exactly love killing animals. I got used to it though, and as I got older, I was not only okay with it, it became something I sort of enjoyed doing. We never just hunted for sport though. We did it for food and to put food on the table. Anything I killed, I was expected to bring home for that same reason. Because I wasn't the biggest guy, even when I was a teenager, that meant I didn't concentrate on big things like deer or anything like that. I was very, very fond of squirrel though. Anyway, I was going coon hunting one night when I was 15 years old. I realized the thought of eating coons might throw people off nowadays, but coon hunting was a pretty big thing where I was raised. When I went coon hunting, I generally started out in the early evening, and then went into the night. I always stayed on the land that my dad owned too. I never strayed onto property that wasn't ours. I also preferred to do all of my hunting alone. I never went with my parents or my brothers or anything. It was just the sort of thing I felt better doing alone. I took my air rifle, which was a present I got when I was 13 years old, and my favorite dog Bruno, and went out to do some hunting. For those of you who don't know much about coon hunting, it's mostly a nighttime thing, although some people will attempt to do it during the day. That always brings less success though. Normally, you let your dog loose on a trail and then tree the raccoon. Once the raccoon is in the tree, you then shoot it. I was always comfortable hunting at night. No one instilled in me a fear of the dark, monsters, or the supernatural. My mind was always solely on the business at hand. I wasn't in any hurry in the early evening to find anything though. I didn't let Bruno just loose and chasing after them right away. I liked strolling out in the woods with him. Bruno was a great dog at this too. He would always follow right beside me as I was out walking. He was still kept on a strong leash though. When he would be raring to go, he would definitely be hard to control. He followed commands really well. In my opinion, was the best hunting dog we ever had. The evening soon turned into night, as I expected it would, before anything happened. Fortunately, I had brought a strong flashlight with me. Although I picked this night because the moon was full, big, and bright, and I saw great in the dark, I didn't need the flashlight often, and Bruno didn't need the light at all. His big nose brought us to everything we were looking for. I was trying my best to be aware of everything that was around me though. I had been hunting enough to drown out all the cricket and frog sounds. Bruno wasn't being very active this night, so I was pretty sure there were no coons around at all. That wasn't a huge surprise though. They weren't always out on our property. After a while, he started pulling on his leash. It seemed he wanted to go after something. I hadn't seen anything myself, so I turned my flashlight on. I kept on searching around, hoping to catch the distinctive flash of yellow in the coon's eyes, but I didn't see it. Even so, I was about to unleash him and let him go, but something stopped me. I think that everything seemed eerily quiet for me in that moment. Don't get me wrong, there were still the sounds of the night as I was used to, but I wasn't really hearing them. With Bruno pulling, something had to be out there somewhere, but I don't know. Something was off to me. Normally, I would have released him right away. And then I noticed it. Something I had never heard before. I heard the coons chittering and screaming and making all sort of noises in the distance. But this sound sounded like many of them together screaming, and it wasn't the cute sound they usually make either. They all seemed to be very, very distressed about something. I could have just followed the sound of them and found them. However, I now decided to release Bruno and let him go. It would be much easier to just follow him. This time, though, I wasn't even thinking about shooting the coons. I wanted to know what was making them make all these noises. I ran and followed Bruno as he ran toward the sounds. I was shining the flashlight everywhere, trying to get some sight of what could possibly be out there. And finally, I did. I got the flash of yellow, which let me know I had spotted a treed raccoon, but for some reason, I didn't take out my rifle to shoot at it. I wanted to know what was going on here. As I got closer, I noticed something shocking. There was a man, probably the same age as I was, on the ground. He looked like he might have been injured or something. Bruno was at the guy's side, completely ignoring all the raccoons who were screaming and crying in the trees. It looked like the man had been pretty savagely beaten. He saw me and immediately started to plead with me for help. "He's gonna come back for me. My leg is hurt. You have to help me get out of here." I tried to calm him down, but the guy was absolutely frantic. I couldn't get him to stop long enough to tell me what was going on. From what he kept saying, though, it sounded like someone was after him. I only found out later that when the attacker saw Bruno running towards him, he'd sprinted off into the woods. I figured all the animals were screaming because they were distressed by the attack on the guy. When I asked him if I could try to help him stand, I noticed he was bloody all over, and he'd been stabbed in several places as well. As I was helping him to his feet, Bruno started barking. I didn't think anything of it at first. I mean, we were surrounded by treed raccoons. However, when I looked in the direction he'd barked in, my blood turned to ice in my veins. My flashlight shined over, only to meet the scariest-looking man I'd ever seen. He was extremely fat and had what looked like boils and scars all over him. His hair was long and unkempt, but the scariest part was the look in his eyes. He looked like he'd just escaped from an institution for the criminally insane or something. I'd never visibly seen someone so psychotic in my entire life. He had a hunting knife in his left hand, and it was covered in blood. This time he didn't flinch as Bruno ran towards him. I guess he'd decided my dog wasn't something to be afraid of. Just the look of the guy caused me to freeze for a moment, terrified beyond belief. I had never seen a horror movie before then. The closest I'd ever come to that would have been watching The Twilight Zone on television. This man looked like he'd stepped right out of an episode. Fortunately, I was an experienced hunter with instincts on my side. I knew how to quickly use my rifle, and that's what I did. I dropped my flashlight to the ground and leveled my rifle. The man was even scarier looking in the dark, but I could still see him, and I still had the gun. I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait for the guy to do anything. He had that bloody knife, and it was very obvious he'd been the one who attacked the young man. I shot at the guy. I think I hit him, but I wasn't completely sure. What I do know is that after the shot, he finally moved. He ran back into the forest, and I couldn't see where he was anymore. I now had a stabbed guy, screaming animals, and a barking dog to deal with. I asked the guy on the ground if he could take the flashlight. He was still strong enough to do so he took it and shined it in different directions, looking for the crazy man as we went along. We couldn't see him anywhere. Don't get me wrong, not seeing him was somewhat of a relief. I didn't exactly want to go after the guy in the woods. I didn't want Bruno to go after him either. All I wanted to do was get this injured guy and myself to safety. Fortunately, his legs hadn't been stabbed, so he was still able to walk. He was very fatigued, though, and had to lean on me to move forward. He was frantically shining his flashlight in case the psycho came back to attack. I was sure if he did, though, Bruno would alert us before it happened. All the raccoons had now calmed down for the most part. I really don't know what to think about their reaction. I mean, they may have just been distressed because they noticed two animals fighting in their vicinity. But I don't know. For some reason, it almost seemed like they were screaming to try and get help for this hurt guy. Maybe they were trying to scare the crazy guy off or something. I don't know. What I do know is they led Bruno and I to the scene and saved this guy's life. Getting home was long and terrifying. I was expecting the man to pounce out of the woods at every moment. Fortunately, though, he did not try to attack again. The entire time I could feel him watching, though. I could feel his crazy eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I was able to get the kid, who I later learned to be named Vance, back to my parents' house. We drove him to the hospital, which was a pretty long drive. I learned later that Vance had been doing the same thing as me, but he didn't have a dog with him. He was attacked out of nowhere when the crazy guy just began stabbing him for no reason. He didn't know the guy at all. It was just a completely random attack. The guy had come out of the woods from nowhere. That's when all the animals started screaming, and Bruno took off running. This happened back in the 1970s. About a month later, a dead body was found in those same woods, stabbed to death. They never caught who did it, but in my mind I knew exactly who that killer was. As for me, I decided not to hunt coons anymore after that. There was something about my experience that night that changed it for me. I couldn't bring myself to shoot them, even though I had many times before. Vance healed up fine in the end, and we ended up being friends for a while. He never went hunting again though, and I completely understand why. I live in a really scary-looking house. I inherited it from a fairly wealthy aunt when she passed away. In the town that I lived in, it was considered the spook house. Kids thought it was haunted, and a lot of them even thought my aunt was a witch for whatever reason. She wasn't a recluse or anything, but she did spend a lot of time alone. I was definitely aware of all of this when I decided to move into that house. I didn't really care much for it though. I've been a writer and am successful enough to live on the income I get from my writings, so I spent a lot of time at home anyway. Honestly, I came to wonder if the kids might think I was a witch just like they did with my aunt. I never heard any of them call me that though, and the kids didn't ever try to harass me or anything. Honestly, I think they were too scared to come anywhere near me or the house really. Anyway, I quite enjoyed living there. It was pretty big for only one person, but it was very comfortable. My aunt even had a reading robe that was on the east side of the house. It was filled with books and had a very comfortable couch for sitting and reading. I spent a lot of time in there reading some quality literature. One evening, I was reading a particularly good book when I began to feel this odd feeling for some reason. Even today, I can't really explain exactly what it was. It was just a very off feeling that I was not able to shake. It also kept me from being able to get lost in my book. After a while, I decided to get up and check around what was causing this feeling. The sun hadn't quite set yet, but it was in the process of doing so. Everything outside was a very bright orange color. I went out to the front room and looked out of the window. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a dark figure run out of my yard and onto the sidewalk. It was from the very corner of my eye, and it happened so quickly I didn't get a good look at the figure. Knowing about the history of the house, I chalked it up to just being a kid doing something weird. Maybe one of his friends had dared him to go up to the spook house or something. Maybe he'd seen me in the window, lost his nerve, and ran off. Made perfect sense to me. I don't know how I had that sense, but it seemed unimportant to me. I decided to go back and get back to reading. After a while, I decided I wanted to get myself a cup of tea. I went in the kitchen to put on the kettle, and then I started to get that weird feeling again. This time, though, I turned around and looked out the kitchen window right away. I didn't see anything at first, but after a moment, I saw a bush shake just a little bit. It was dark outside already, so I really couldn't see very much at this point. Someone emerged from behind that bush and ran off into the darkness. Once again, I thought that some kid was trying to torment me, and I put it out of my mind for the moment. As I mentioned, I had accepted everything that came with the house, including the local children being silly sometimes. I didn't think it was too important, or that I should call the police or anything. They hadn't really done anything anyway. I got my tea ready and went back to read my book. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but then I began to hear something as well. It was like a light tapping noise. I thought maybe it was an animal outside, but then I realized it was rhythmic. I realized it had to be a person. I looked over at my window. My eyes adjusted, and I saw a human hand. It was reaching up from just below the window and tapping on the window panes. The first two incidents hadn't bothered me too much, but I considered this one to be going too far. I got up and walked over to the window. Someone was there, but when they saw me approaching, they quickly ran off toward the front yard. I was irritated enough that I ran through the house to the front door to confront them. I yelled out to whoever was out there that they should cut it out right now, or I would be calling the police. I didn't see anyone at all though, even though I had turned the porch light on and gotten there relatively quickly. I went back into the house, a bit annoyed but getting over it pretty quickly. I went back to reading. It seemed my threat had been taken seriously, as I wasn't bothered at all for the rest of the night. I was able to read and relax and then finally go to bed peacefully. I had been asleep for a short time when I was suddenly woken up by something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I thought I must have heard something outside. Instantly, I remembered the earlier incidents, maybe that person had come back or something. I got up to investigate. I put on my robe and walked down the stairs without turning any of the lights on. I was used to the ambient light of the house, so I had no problem seeing until I got to the bottom. I saw something moving in the dark and turned on the light switch at the bottom of the stairs. I immediately heard a sound in the front room of the house. Going over toward that direction, a person sprinted out into the hallway. Only it was not a kid. It was a fully grown man. Before I could react, the man pulled a big knife out of his jacket. He warned me he would come back and kill me if I called the police. He was trying to cover his face with the arm while also brandishing the knife. I only got a slightly good look at him because of this. I was terrified, honestly. I figured he was just going to attack me right there and then. To my relief, though, the man ran out the door and into the night. Of course, I almost didn't call the police. I was so terrified he really would come back. I knew I had to, though, so I did. It was scary doing it, imagining this man might find out and come back to finish me. As far as I'm aware, the police never caught the guy either. I mean, that didn't mean he was free exactly. He could have been arrested for something else, but as far as I knew, he could come back at any time. For the longest time, this entire thing scared me to death. Little sounds and things like that would terrify me. I kept thinking it was that guy coming back. Fortunately, though, he never showed up again. The terror from that incident and the possibility of him following up on his threat, though, has stuck with me for a very long time. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.